Let's talk about the pros and cons of discrimination in the USA. I'm sure you are thinking to yourself why I have included pros and cons in my opening statement. Aren't there only bad things that result in discrimination? Well, the answer in most cases is yes. When we discriminate, a negative outcome usually results. However, let's say you are an employer of a business and the government has told you that you must hire a certain number of women or a certain percentage of black and white people. This would restrain you from hiring, promoting, and firing your employees. Okay, let's take a step back and discuss why in some cases individual freedom to choose or discriminate who will work for you can be a good thing. During the past 40 years, the American government has put rules in place to increase the protection of the environment and groups such as minorities, women, workers, and consumers. These new rules have resulted in numerous regulations and new bodies of law, which in some cases have resulted in extreme policies, like the one I described before about an employer not being able to select an employee of his or her choice based on sex or color. As a result, opponents argue that individualism has been lost with these new laws. On the other side of the coin, some anti-discrimination proponents argued against the traditional division of occupational roles between men and women. These arguments led to major legal cases, which in turn led to strong requirements to recruit women for jobs usually held by men, such as skilled manual and mechanical work on construction sites. The U.S. Congress also allowed the entry of women into the military academies. In fact, a strong effort was made, particularly during the late 1970s, to not only recruit women into all branches of the armed services, other than those directly involved in combat, but also to train women together with men. Another anti-discriminatory example involves the Department of Justice, which began to change the traditional names of specific jobs from firemen and policemen to firefighters and police officers, and required local police and fire forces to hire women police officers and firefighters. Discriminatory examinations and tests in both the public and private sectors were soon abolished, and soon every business was told to avoid favoring one sex over another for specific jobs. These new laws resulted in the progress of equality because most occupations were now open to women and none were closed to people of color. And now, class, let's switch gears and discuss a different topic. Consumer Price Index, CPI for short. If you switched on the TV and heard on the news that the CPI in Canada was 2.1%, what does that mean? In a nutshell, it means that Canadian consumers paid 2.1% more than in the previous year for the goods and services included in the CPI basket. Although prices of goods and services rise and fall over time, when prices change too dramatically, they can have negative effects on an economy. In order to tell if an economy is experiencing inflation, deflation, or stagflation, we use the CPI as a gauge of the prices of goods and services. Believe it or not, when the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics releases the CPI data monthly, the CPI's results are widely anticipated and watched. Who would eagerly await the results, you might ask? Well, the CPI plays a role for many key financial decision makers, including individual investors, the Bank of Canada in Canada, and the Federal Reserve in the U.S. The CPI helps the Bank of Canada forecast the interest rate policy and other decisions of major banks and corporations. I mentioned the CPI basket before, and now I want to expand on what this basket is and how we get the information. The base year market basket, which makes up the CPI, comes from detailed expenditure information collected from surveys of thousands of families. The information is not randomly collected. Instead, the information is gathered through interviews and diaries kept by participants who have agreed to disclose their buying habits. The basket is divided into 8 groups: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and other goods and services, and includes more than 200 categories. Finally, the prices of 80,000 items in the market basket are collected monthly from thousands of retail stores, service establishments, rental units, and doctors' offices.
Before you undertake a career in the arts, there are a number of factors to consider. Whether your goal is to be an actor or an animator, a saxophonist or a sculptor, talent is an essential consideration. But talent alone won't guarantee a successful career in the arts. You also need training, experience, and self-discipline. Most importantly, however, you should realize that a career in the arts requires a personal sense of commitment, a calling, because art does have a history of insecure employment. A lot of artists find it difficult, even impossible, to live on the money they make from their art. Most have to supplement their income by teaching or by working behind the scenes or by doing other work not related to the arts.
In your opinion, what's the best way for us to know if we really have a calling to art?
Well, those of you who are interested in art as a career should talk with arts professionals or work in the arts yourselves. Professionals can give good first-hand advice, but experience is the best way to get a feel for the field.
What kind of experience? I mean, how do we get started?
Experience doesn't have to be formal. It can be part-time or volunteer work. For example, if you want to be a photographer or graphic designer, you could work for your school newspaper. Or if your interest is acting, you could start out in community theater. The important thing is getting started, spending time doing something in your chosen medium.
Number 5.
us. The men of the North Woods tribes were the hunters. The hunting season began in the fall and continued until midwinter. These expeditions frequently took the hunters away from the village for long periods of time. Moose, deer, beaver, bear, and elk were the animals sought. Large deer drives were common, and small animals were taken with snares or the bow and arrow.
Did the women ever go hunting with the men?
The women often accompanied their husbands on hunting parties. Their job was to take charge of the camps.
Do you mean they just cooked for the men? I thought the Native Americans had more of a system of equality.
Overall, men and women shared the labor. On hunting expeditions, women basically supported the men, whose job was to procure the game. On the other hand, women controlled other realms of life. For example, women managed all of the agricultural operations. Also, a woman headed each clan, and these women were respected for their role as keepers of the clan.
Readjusting to life in your own country after living abroad for some time is a little like recovering from jet lag after a long flight across several time zones. It takes time. And research indicates that after 9 years of living in a foreign country, you never really do readjust. Of course, things have changed. Governments have come and gone. What you knew as countryside has become a suburb. New technologies have changed the way people go about their daily lives, and so on. These changes may well have been taking place in your adopted country, but they were happening while you were there, so you could adapt as you went along. Those are not the main difficulties, however. It is in the smaller, everyday things that you might experience what is known as culture shock, although it's not really a shock, but puzzling all the same. For example, the precise way to behave at a supermarket checkout may have changed, and in ordinary conversation, the frames of reference have changed, and quite often you find that you don't really know what people are talking about, even though they are speaking your native tongue.
Yes, it's funny you should mention Merwin. Until about a year ago, I thought England was the only country that had a poet laureate. After all, it's a pretty odd job, isn't it? No salary to speak of and just a barrel of wine or something as payment. But he was, or is, the American poet laureate, isn't he?
That's right, but quite a few other countries have one too.
I know. I looked into it a bit. Other countries in the UK for a start. Wales, as you'd expect, with their Eisteddfods and long poetic tradition. And Ireland and Scotland. I think some places that were colonies or in the Commonwealth have them. Canada, for example. And who's that wonderful Caribbean poet? The one that wrote Omeros.
Derek Walcott.
That's him. He was the poet laureate of St. Lucia. But what about the rest of Europe? Don't the French have such a thing?
No, I don't think so. They've got the Academy, and you get elected to that if you're considered the best in your field. But I think Germany might have. No, it wasn't Germany. Somewhere else, but I don't remember. By the way, you're a bit behind the times in thinking what they get paid as a barrel of wine. All that changed long ago. But one of the more recent ones asked to have it back. Noises are defined as disagreeable sounds, but this suggests that they are no more than an annoyance, something to be put up with. There is increasing evidence that noise, on the scale that people who live in big cities have to deal with, is dangerous and can give rise to serious health and social problems, some of which, such as its effects on people's behaviour and anger levels, you might not have thought were caused by noise and are health concerns. There is, of course, the almost constant noise of traffic, though this isn't a particularly modern problem. In ancient Rome, there were rules to minimise the noise made by the iron wheels of wagons, which battered the stones on the pavement, causing disruption of sleep. Traffic noise is one of the health hazards, as it can lead to other problems like noise-induced hearing impairment. It is also highly distracting, interfering with speech communication and leisure time relaxation. And while this doesn't drive you mad in the medical sense, it is intensely annoying and can lead to mental health problems. Also, noise, whether you work in a place where loud machinery is operating or not, can have an effect on performance at work. Though in itself not a health matter, this can lead to other problems.
The earliest writers on politics, and I'm thinking of Plato and Aristotle here, felt free to draw insights from all areas of human knowledge, unlike modern academic writers who tend to put things into smaller and smaller compartments or focus more closely on one area of inquiry. For example, Plato would examine a whole political system and the philosophy that underlies it, whereas modern writers on politics might concentrate on one particular institution in that system, the House of Lords in England, or on voting patterns within a country. With this focus, the bigger questions that the ancients dealt with, what is the best form of government, or what is justice, tend to get left behind. Many writers on politics these days are university-based, and so have to have specialised interests. And while they may make new and interesting discoveries in their special field, it is at the loss of a broader perspective, not to mention the loss of a general audience or readership. In the 19th century, there were still writers who used the same freedom of inquiry as the ancients, and are all the more readable and relevant because of it.
Certainly in Europe and the West, we tend to think of bread as the staple food in our diet, as many proverbs and sayings such as "bread is the staff of life" attest. Yet for the majority of the world's population, the most important staple food is not wheat, but rice, which is the seed of a different type of grass. The earliest evidence we have of rice being cultivated dates back to 8,000 years ago, when rice grains of that period were discovered in a village in China. By around 6,000 years ago, the cultivation of both long-grain and short-grain rice had become well established in China and had just got going in India. The word rice itself, however, is derived from the Aramaic urutsa and came to us by way of Greek and Arabic. In fact, it was the Arabs who introduced rice to their Spanish territories in the 7th century, but it didn't spread to the rest of Europe until much later when, in the 15th century, Spaniards began to cultivate their own short-grain variety at Pisa in Italy.
There are two main reasons why parents decide to educate their children at home. Either they dislike schools on principle, however odd those principles might be, or they don't believe their local schools provide an adequate education or the right sort of education for their children. If someone decides to teach their child at home, either by themselves or by employing a teacher, they have to convince their local education authority, LEA, that the teaching provided is satisfactory. Schedules, lesson plans and book lists must be shown, and it must also be demonstrated that the child is in fact learning and that they have adequate opportunities for physical education and meeting other children. Furthermore, while there is no formal assessment, officers from the LEA will come and inspect what is being done and look at the child's exercise books. If they are not satisfied, they make out a school attendance order.